In our interview segment tonight, we're talking to John Taylor. Mr. Taylor, an economist, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, served as U.S. Undersecretary of Treasury from 2001 to 2005. As such, he was responsible for oversight of both the IMF and the World Bank for the White House. He is perhaps best known among economists around the world for what is called the Taylor Rule. That sets out an equation for central banks to follow in setting interest rate policies. I spoke with him recently, and tonight we have the first of our two parts. Professor Taylor, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
There have been predictions here from the central bank governor that we're in a V-shaped recession. Now, for that to be true, we'll need to see a similar V-shape out of the U.S. and with our trading partners in Europe. What do you see lying ahead?
I think we're already beginning to see some rebounds. Whether you call it a V or a U, I think depends to some extent on how you define those. I think in the current quarter, which is just about to end in the United States, we should see 3% real growth, maybe a little bit more than that, quite frankly. That's sort of like a U to me. I think that there's a general feeling we could be stronger than that. Now, you also have some very strong rebounds in Brazil and India and, of course, China. Europe is a little bit more than the U.S. But I think those are all consistent with the view of a V-shape, and I certainly hope that's the case.
Now, when you look at Europe, there are certain differences among the various countries here. You've got France, you've got Germany leading the way out, England not so much, sputtering along, Spain certainly not. Do you see any consistency among any of them?
I think that's true. On the other hand, there's compared to previous recoveries, there's a great degree of simultaneity. And I think that's because the world economy was hit so hard last fall by the panic. And that was a simultaneous. You could see that just within days, so many countries and stock markets being hit. And that really, I think, was arrested earlier this year. And so now you're seeing, if you like, a simultaneous recovery, though at different rates, as you indicate. To some extent, that's because of, as you mentioned, Spain and the UK. They did have some housing bubbles and serious concerns with the financial sector compared to Germany, where there wasn't really the housing crisis as much as the other countries.
So as you look at the world, do you consider it still in crisis or well past?
You know, I don't think it's the right way to think about the crisis is well past. I think we got started on this crisis in the summer of 2007, so it's 2 years ago. And I think it's going to be like that for a while. It won't be as bad as last fall where we had that panic. The panic, if you like, has subsided and people realize this is not a repeat of the Great Depression. That was really, I think, an exaggeration. So people are beginning to, fortunately, see that that's not the case. But we're still, the financial system is still fragile. I think it'll take a while to sort it all out. So I wouldn't say it's over. The panic is over. But the crisis feelings, if you like, the crisis ramifications are still lingering.
And looking at the dangers ahead, what missteps do you fear most by the government?
Well, I think the biggest misstep is overreaching, responding disproportionately, which I think has already happened in many cases. We have seen stimulus packages which are huge by any historical comparison. I don't think those are the reasons we're getting the recovery at all. The recovery began earlier than those, but they are going to have some legacy effects. Large debt levels in the United States, they're growing very rapidly, or debt to GDP ratio is rising. So depending on the country, if you like, the legacy effects of the responses can be a drag on the expansion, the recovery in the future.
So would we have been better off without the stimulus packages?
You know, I think there's a lot of evidence that, yes, that's the case. You could, of course, had better designed ones, but if the choice is between what actually came out and what and nothing, I think nothing would have been better. Again, I would like to have seen some policies where, for example, in the United States, the infrastructure had a greater focus, or permanent tax rate reductions had a greater focus, but we didn't get that. Those would have been better, absolutely.
And when you consider the after effects of the stimulus, what fears does that raise? Certainly inflation's one, but do you see other possible after effects?
Yes, it's not just inflation, but that's one of the things. In addition to the debt increases, the monetary authorities have responded very aggressively, and so they have to now unwind, if you like, what they've done. The exit strategy is needed, and whether that's going to be politically easy or not is a question. In addition to the inflation, I think there could be higher interest rates because of the debt. The United States in particular, there's a concern about the dollar. The dollar has depreciated, and it is depreciating for a while now, and so it's important, I think, that the United States maintains its strong dollar policy. I think it's important for global stability. But those are the things, the higher interest rates, the concerns about the dollar, and inflationary pressures down the road.
The Taylor Rule describes how central bankers may apply interest rates given certain economic conditions. I don't know if the current White House has asked for your advice on this, but if you have applied the Taylor Rule, what sort of exit strategy, what should the future be looking like?
Yes, the Taylor Rule is actually surprisingly getting a lot of interest these days, and I say surprisingly because it's a rule that suggests what central banks should set for the interest rate, and the United States interest rate is effectively zero. But it still gets a lot of interest, and people ask me about it all the time because it's kind of a guide of, as you say, what the exit's going to look like. So right now I think the Taylor Rule says the Fed is just about right with the interest rate close to zero. But what that means, if we're fortunate and have a nice V-shape recovery, or if we're unfortunate and have a pickup in inflation, that means they're going to have to raise rates. And I say it could very well be in the first part of next year. Others are saying it's a longer period away. But that's how I use the Taylor Rule, and I think others do as well at this time.
Since we're talking about the Taylor Rule, and you've worked with many central bankers in emerging markets, is it possible to rank the issues that central bankers must apply in a certain rating or order? Obviously, they're concerned about inflation and concerned about stimulus, interest rate fluctuations. What advice would you give them in what order for the steps to be taken?
I think you have to rank the inflation at the top of the list, no matter how you think about this. Keeping inflation in check is a very good guideline for central banks. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be concerned at all about the recessions and the decline in economic activity. And the Taylor Rule, in fact, brings both inflation and the state of the overall economy, whether there's a recession or not, into play. Both factors are important. But I think the experience that we've had in the last 25 years are that if central banks focus more on the inflation with some concerns for stability, that things work better. What we've found in our research here is that monetary policy, if you like, got off track, and that had repercussions with the housing boom and a lot of the excesses, which eventually led to this crisis. So looking forward, I think we have a lot of evidence that monetary policy of the kind that was used in the United States in the 80s and 90s and began to be used in emerging markets more frequently in the latter part of that period worked very effectively. And if I just might add, I know this is a long answer, I think for some emerging market countries, the idea of joining some kind of a currency union, I know that's a hot topic in Europe, that can very well be productive. In that way you're sharing in the monetary policy decisions. You have to be careful about it, but I think that's an alternative for especially small, open, emerging market economies.
Now when we come back, we'll take a look ahead at the headlines on the English page of the Business Standard Tuesday and what you can expect in world economic news. And I'll have some closing thoughts on this the first night of the program. We'll be right back.